Right. Now, this one is about Professor Richard Wolff. He's given us another economic update, but this time with a little bit more of a historical perspective here. Let me go ahead and bring him up on the screen. Now, this was done with RJ Esco. He's met with him before on his show called The 0 Hour. And there's something he does here that I really, really like. He makes the comparison between where we are economically right now and where we were economically in this country in the 1970s. And I also have a graph. I have some numbers I'm going to show you that I think may shock you when you see just how bad things are economically in this country today. So let's go ahead and get into that.
1980, you could actually go back into the 1970s and you would see a number that most commentators have been struggling with now for the following reason. We're talking half a century. From 1972 to now is 1/2 of a century. Basically, across that century, the real wages, that is the amount of money we give to an average worker, adjusted for what he or she has to pay when they spend that money on food, clothing, shelter, and so on. In other words, to understand the wage as the money and the affordability of the money you get, what you can buy with it, there's been no change. We have flatlined the American working class. And the important thing about that is that for the previous 100 to 150 years, that was not the case. This country raised the real wage. That is, whatever happened to prices, wages went up more than.
Notice he said this country raised the real wage. That's what used to happen. When is the last time we increased the minimum wage in this country? Minimum wage is what? Still $7.25 an hour? Just something to think about.
That so that worker could afford more. That's why we have in America things like the American dream or the notion of American exceptionalism. For 100, 150 years, capitalism in America gave more real income to the bulk of its working class. Not, of course, to African Americans, not particularly to women, but overwhelmingly to the white male population. It was a rising standard of living.
And that changed. And I like the fact that Professor Wolff was sure to include, not necessarily to African Americans, not necessarily for women's, but for the white male working class. This country, at one point, it used to actually raise the wage the way that it was supposed to be raised. That way they could afford products. That way they could afford, like when prices increases, the wages went up to help them along the way. That is not happening today. And I don't mean just for inflation for 2022. That wasn't happening last year. That wasn't happening in 2020. That wasn't happening in 2019, 2018, 2017. That hasn't been happening for a long time. And here we are today. So you have a group of people, working class people, and let's also say people who are poor too. You have a group of people that for the past 10, actually, I think he said 50 years. I'm gonna show you the chart in a second. It's actually 50 years. For the past 50 years, the wages never caught up. This is why we tell people even that $15 ask for minimum wage, that's actually still less than it should be when you account for inflation throughout the years. So people are trying to play catch up, and now we have these increased gas prices. I know they're starting to go down a little bit, but not enough for me. Increased gas prices. The grocery store prices are heavily increased. God, good luck trying to buy meat at the grocery store right now. Like I said, if you want to become a vegetarian, now is a good time. But Now you have people who were already underpaid to begin with, then the prices increased. Your wages are still not increasing. So people are just trying to catch up. We're just barely keeping your head above water. That's what's happening right now. So a lot of people are saying it's because of the pandemic. Well, no. Most of the people that I talk to who are struggling financially right now were already struggling financially before the pandemic even happened. The pandemic just made it worse. And now you have inflation.
That stopped in the early 1970s. And here comes the important point. It never resumed. In other words, it bounced around a little, as that Bureau of Labor Statistics graph will show you. But the long-term 50 years, nothing. Now, during those 50 years, the productivity of American workers went up every year, 1 to 2%. But, over 50 years, we're then talking doubling, tripling, an enormous increase. Why do I tell you that? Because productivity measures, in effect, what the worker gives to the employer, just like the real wage measures what the employer gives to the worker.
So the productivity over the past 50 years has increased, meaning we've been giving more to the employer. But when it comes to the real wage, the employer has been giving less to us. This is what's been happening. So you're going into work, you may be working longer hours. I went through all this. You might be working longer hours, but it's still not really paying off financially because the employer has not increased the real wage. So who's benefiting in this situation that we've had for the past 50 years? It's been the employers, not the employees, unless you have like a government job. But other than that, the employer is the one who's been benefiting. So I want to say this again for people who are just coming in. Just because the productivity increased, that does not mean the real wage increased. And productivity increase doesn't necessarily mean it's a good thing for the employee. That's a good thing for the employer. Basically, employers have been exploiting our labor, but more so over the past 50 years. So again, this is not something that started with the pandemic.
If what the employer gave to the worker is flat for 50 years, as we've just discussed, it was, and as the data all show, but if what the worker gives the employer goes up steadily for 50 years, guess what? We become a vastly more unequal society because the rich who own the businesses, either directly or by buying shares of stock, they're picking up the growing gap between what the employer gives the worker and the growing output that the worker gives the employer. So there's your explanation for the inequality that is off the chart. 50 years ago, the United States was less unequal than, say, Britain or France or Italy and so on. Now we are much more unequal than those societies. All of that is wrapped up in these statistics. And the people who sit on top, the big businessmen and women, the politicians, they own and buy. We could talk about Uber last week, a stunningly wonderful example of all of that. Republicans and Democrats alike have been presiding for 50 years over this process.
The politicians are complicit as well. The politicians have been residing over this structure for the past 50 years. There's something I want to mention to you that I've been thinking about for a while. You notice you hear a lot of talking points on mainstream media, and I saw this on the political arena debate stages as well. You hear a lot of the politicians say we have to look at the middle class. The middle class is shrinking. But you never hear them frame it in this way, which is the working class and the poor is increasing. because that's really what's happening. They don't want to say that because that's not as sexy, right? That's not as attractive. That's really what's happening, though. A lot of Democrat politicians say this. The middle class is shrinking. We got to look out and protect the middle class. The middle class is shrinking because the working class and the poor are increasing. They don't tell you that part. And why is it always these politicians? Why do they always say we have to protect and look out for the working class? Excuse me, not the working class. We have to protect and look out for the middle class. Sometimes I guess they will say working class. Don't really hear them saying we have to protect and look out for the poor, though. In fact, you rarely hear them mention poor people. It's a lot of times it's middle class, sometimes working class. But when it comes to people who are poor, they're silent on that. Hit that like button, guys. That helps me with the algorithm. Got to keep those likes coming.
Hasn't made any difference. The rate of the gap growing between what is given to the wealthy by the workers and what they don't get in return has gotten wider and wider, whether or not a Republican or a Democrat was sitting in the White House or presiding in Congress. It really made no difference. So they're all culpable. And now to say, and I'm blown away, RJ, as much as you are, maybe more, to have the head of the Federal Reserve get up in his rich businessman outfit and stand there and talk about how we're going to deal with an inflation, which, by the way, is why the number is terrible these days, because workers' wages are rising at roughly half the rate of our prices, and therefore workers are falling behind. But to stand there and to say, we're going to deal with this inflation, which, by the way, reflects that the Federal Reserve hasn't been able to do its job, because its job, written in its charter, is to maintain price stability.
Uh-oh. And that was not something that I knew before I watched this episode. Did you guys hear what he just said about the Federal Reserve's responsibility to maintain price stability?
Hello, inflation means you didn't do that. Stable is not an inflation. So to stand there and to say, we're going to deal with this inflation, by the way, he's been saying that for the entire last year, and to date, no sign of it. But to say it, and he's going to raise interest rates because that will bring down demand. Whoa. Who gets hurt by an inflation? Who gets hurt when you raise the price of something? Who gets hurt when you raise the interest rate on borrowed money? The answer is the poor. That's all markets allocate whatever is scarce based on how much money you have. That's what
This is the part too that I want to mention to people as well. If you are making $7.25 an hour, federal minimum wage, if you're making that right now, and let's say where you live, gas is like $4 a gallon right now, you're not really making anything. Because depending on how far you have to drive to get back and forth to work, which has been the case for some people that I've spoken to, you're basically working to pay to put gas into your car to get back and forth from work. So what does that mean for those people? They may have to pick up a second job. Now you got to pick up a second job. Now you got to talk to your first job and let them know that you had to pick up a second job. And then you have to try to see if they're willing to work with you in reference to shifts. Maybe you may have to switch to a morning schedule with that employer and go for the evening schedule with the next employer. And not everybody is as understanding about that, by the way. I've worked 2 jobs before, so I know. So I don't know how, and I've said this before, if You have to drive to get to work. We got to remind everybody here, not everyone has public transportation. If you have to drive to get to work and you're making $7.25 an hour, how are you feeling right now? Let me know. Let me know.
Market does. It bids up the price of whatever is scarce, and then only the rich can afford it. So you're solving a problem based on 50 years of redistributing income from the bottom and the middle to the top by doing more of the same, by choosing policies that are more costly to the poor and the middle than they are to the rich. The rich person doesn't care if the price of milk doubles. It makes no difference. But for a poor or middle income family with children, it makes a big difference. What are you doing acting as though we were all in the boat together and we're going to constrain demand by what are you talking about? You are using a language carefully edited so that no one understands the discrimination against the vast majority of the people that's going on here. When Mr. Powell talks,
I just want to interrupt here for a second and echo what he said about the rich, how they're not penalized. They're not affected. They're really not. People who are rich, they're not affected by the fact of if milk goes up, if gas goes up, they're not affected like a lot of us are. It doesn't hurt them the way it would hurt us. It doesn't hurt them the way that it would hurt someone who's making $7.25 an hour. Because I'm still trying to figure out how those people are affording groceries right now and gas. And for the people who want to chime in and say, oh, well, they should just get on food stamps. It's not that easy. It's not that easy. When I was struggling, I know I didn't fit the criteria to even get any type of assistance from the government. I had just missed that window. So I couldn't get any type of food stamps or anything like that. And there's a lot of people in that situation where they fall right in that financial window where they miss it just by this much. So they're still having to pay those full prices for groceries. I don't know what they're doing. I don't know how they're doing it. God forbid if they have like a baby and they have to buy diapers or if they have to buy formula. Not everyone can breastfeed. God forbid.
He is disrespecting, he is hurting, he is discriminating against the working class majority. It's as if he got up there and announced an interesting new social program. However, unfortunately, this will not be available to Black people or brown people or female people. We would sit there staring at the sheer gall of an official talking like that. But here we have the same thing, but we have a mainstream media that nods along as if there was something reasonable, normal, routine. It isn't. It is the very thing that is splitting and ripping this society apart is being enacted by people who do not figure it out, or they don't care, or in my experience, they don't figure it out because they don't care. And then the two sides reinforce each other and they become the Bidens, the Trumps, the Powells of our society.
And there you have it. And I know you guys didn't get to hear RJ, but honestly, that's really the part you really need to hear is this. I'm sorry, but yeah, if you want to see this full interview, this is on RJ Esco's show. It's called The 0 Hour. And the name of this segment is Richard Wolff on the banality of evil economics. So definitely check it out if you want to watch the whole thing. It's about 35 minutes long. But I want to show you some numbers in reference to what Professor Wolff was saying. I do want to go ahead and get into a couple of graphs here because I want you to see what he's actually talking about. Okay, let's take a look at this, ladies and gentlemen. Now, this is what Richard Wolff is referring to. I don't know about you guys, but I do like to see graphs. I do like to see, we're going to be talking about numbers and dollars and cents here. I do like to see some type of a graph. So let's go ahead and show you what is happening and what he's referring to. I'm going to show you what the dollar was worth in 1970, what it's worth today, and you're going to see this whole productivity piece that he was talking about as well. So it says here, $100, let me make this a little bit bigger. Okay, that's good. $100 in 1970 is worth $763.69 today. That's not a lot. 1970, $763.69 today. The US dollar has lost 87% of its value since 1970. 87%. That's terrible. Let's go on. $100 in 1970 is equivalent in purchasing power to about $763.69 today, an increase of $663.69 over 52 years. The dollar had an average inflation rate of 3.99% per year between 1970 and today, producing a cumulative price increase of 663.69%. Let me make this a little bit larger. I'm sorry. Thought it was bigger for you guys. People in the back. This means that today's prices are 7.64 times higher than average prices since 1970. And now this is according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics Consumer Price Index. A dollar today only buys 13.094% of what it could buy back then. Guys, take notes on this. Homework lesson for tonight. Take notes on this. A dollar today only buys 13.094% of what it could in 1970. Not even 40%, not even 50%, 13%. This is a problem. This is why I keep telling people I've seen these numbers before. By the way, you can go to this site oftentimes every day and you'll see different rates. Like you can go to this site as many times as possible. It adjusts daily. So the problem that we have here is that economically, we're in trouble. I feel you, Hella Cook. This shit's not right. I feel you. You're right. But there's more. The inflation rate in 1970 was 5.72%. The current inflation rate compared to last year is now 9.06%. If this number holds, $100 today will be equivalent in buying power to $109.06 next year. The current inflation rate page gives more detail on the latest inflation rates. So I want to go down here because I do want to show you those graphs. Now, I hope when it didn't, okay. Great. All right, there's the buying power one, and then there's this one. All right, let's look at both of these graphs. Here's the graph that shows the buying power of $100 in 1970. So it's going to show you here. Let me show you so at the bottom of the graph, you can see all the years here, and it goes all the way to 2022. So here we go. 1970, $100. I like how it marks it like that. Notice This is adjusted for inflation. So let's follow this all the way up. See how it just continues to increase, right? Follow this all the way up. Whoopsie. Right here to 2022, 763.69, right? That number checks out. Now, let's look at the second chart. When 100 is equivalent to 763.69 over time, that means that the real value of a single US dollar decreases over time. In other words, a dollar will pay for fewer items at the store. So you guys see, that's the thing. Because if you just look at this graph, it's like, oh, okay, it's been increasing. That's a good thing. No. And I'll show you the second graph that shows you why. Buying power of $100 over time. Now, this is from 1970 to 2022. Here's that same $100 over here at the top. And you'll see all of the years at the bottom. If you notice, it continued to go down. Even when we get to, let's go to 91 on here. 1991, $26.95, right? Do you see how quickly the value fell? $100, 1970. It just steadily, boom, boom. Okay, and then we enter here, 1980s. Okay, now we're entering into Reaganomics, which we know it did not trickle down. And then we go all the way over to, excuse me, I don't want to skip over the housing crisis. Pardon me there. Then we get into 2008. Okay, housing crisis. And that was at 17.11. And now we come all the way over to 2022, sorry. 12.42. Do you see the problem? This is terrible. So this is what it's worth now. Like this dollar is worth nothing compared to what it was worth back then. And to add on top of it, you have inflation right now. There's more to this chart too. Like it goes on and shows you different graphs as well. It's really the value of a dollar in the United States has decreased over the years. That's right, George. You're right. The only problem with this graph is scale. It looks like it's flattening out, but it's really accelerating. So this is exactly what Richard Wolff was talking about. Now you can also see inflation by city here as well. There's San Francisco, there's Seattle, Boston. Of course, I knew we were going to be up here. So yeah, not every city is on here, obviously, but they list some of them. And they even talk about inflation by country and so on and so on. But what this means all in all is that the value of the US dollar significantly decreased. For us to only have 13%, to be able to get 13% buying power, show this to as many people, at least that site, if you can. I'm not saying they have to watch the stream, but if you please show them at least that site, because I want people to see when people make that argument that people just need to pull themselves up by the bootstraps. This is the problem. And don't forget housing. Let's not forget that piece of the equation. How much does housing cost now? So it's a problem. It's a problem.